Good afternoon and good evening and good morning. I see people from all over the globe. I'm Dan, and I'm lucky enough to have served as Diane Sweeney's editor for over a decade, beginning with her first book on student-centered coaching. I was immediately drawn to her model of coaching, which is distinctively different from earlier models that aim to fix teachers. Rather than applying the deficit lens that drove much of school reform during the No Child Left Behind era, Diane began with the premise that the relationship between teacher and coach is constellated around the student. Coaching conversations are grounded in student evidence, and coaching cycles are enacted around promoting student growth. 4 successful books on student-centered coaching followed. Diane later introduced me to Leanna Harris, another gifted educator, coach, consultant, and writer who has now co-authored 3 titles with Diane. Both Diane and Leanna currently serve as full-time consultants with Diane's organization, Diane Sweeney Consulting. Diane and Leanna's latest book, the subject of this webinar, was written in response to the urgency of the pandemic. However, we believe its appeal will be timeless when we consider that teaching and learning will never be quite the same in a post-COVID world. When I learned that Diane and Leanna had successfully applied the core principles of student-centered coaching to distance and blended learning environments, I urged them to drop everything and begin writing this book. Anybody with an ounce of vision can appreciate the vital role of coaching as teachers learn to transition to our current brave new world. However, much of this potential remains untapped. My hope is that this webinar, the book upon which it is based, will help coaches, educators, and administrators fully realize the promise of coaching at a distance. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce my authors, teachers, and friends, Diane Sweeney and Leanna Harris.
Thanks, Dan. It's been an amazing 10 years. And this year of all years, as all educators can attest, has been the year of the most growth and the most energy and the most problem solving. And we're really looking forward to bringing this to the group today and to share some of what we've learned as we've been thinking about coaching today and into the future. And one thing that's true that we've all experienced is this pandemic has really made it even more evident that we need to figure out how to continue to coach really in ways where students are engaged in rigorous learning, an environment that creates rigorous learning. And so that's what we're going to be examining today in the webinar. And this really gets at chapter 6 of the new book. And it's a chapter that's long should have been written, but this pandemic, to be honest, as we've experienced, has laid bare so many inequities in our schooling system that this chapter almost, Leanna, I think would attest, almost wrote itself as we really strive to figure out ways to make sure kids are learning, no matter what the conditions are that are surrounding them. So we're really looking forward to digging in with you today, and I'm going to turn it over to Leanna to kind of start the conversation. And as you'll see, we drive with beliefs, and we'll do that today as well.
Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for being here. This is an exciting opportunity for myself and for Diane to share this work. And as Diane said, there's a lot that's new, but there's so much that is just built on our biggest and deepest beliefs. This first one being that we believe that coaches have the biggest impact when they partner with teachers to help all students reach rigorous goals for learning. And I want to highlight 2 words in here. One is the word all, and the other is the word rigorous. All really reminds us that this is about equity. And if there's one thing we've learned over the past year is that the inequities that already existed in our schools, in many of our schools, were laid even more bare as we've all faced the consequences and the challenges brought on by the pandemic and the shift to different learning environments. So it is our true belief that this is about all students, or we could say it's about each and every student, no matter their native language, no matter their learning disposition, their learning abilities or differences, and anything else that is involved with that. That really this is about every one of our students every day. And with that is that word rigorous, that we're not just talking about the delivery of low-level skills to some students and this big, meaty, critical thinking kind of work for other kids. But what we're talking about is access for all students to content that is grade level and even beyond, but at least grade level content, grade level standards, and that is relevant and truly rigorous. So that's what we want to talk about today, within the context very much of the environment that we're still finding ourselves in, where many of us are still in virtual settings or hybrid settings, or maybe our in-person setting is in many ways still at a distance with masks and physical distancing, and in ways that we think will go far beyond this moment when things return to the new normal or whatever we're going to call it. All of this we feel will still be incredibly relevant. So let's talk for a minute about what that looks like on our next slide here. Many of you have seen this before. It came out with this kind of new format, our thinking around different ways of coaching, different approaches to coaching in this format in our last book, The Essential Guide for Student-Centered Coaching. But maybe you saw this information before that where it used to be in 3 separate columns. But I want to orient you just to a couple of things that we feel supports that strong belief that I just shared. We're looking at 3 different kinds of coaching here. On the outer ring, relationship-driven coaching. The next one, teacher-centered coaching. And then in the kind of reddish color there, student-centered coaching. And in the middle, you see the bullseye of our dartboard of student learning. And what we feel this represents is the idea that as much of our time as possible when we work as coaches in the role of coaches should be focused on trying to get into that bullseye, getting as tight and as close into student learning as possible. And again, about equity. Student learning for every one of our students, student learning that's meaty and meaningful and rigorous. So, and intellectually engaging, all things that we're going to be talking about. And how we do that, you can see as you're looking around here and hopefully reading as I'm talking some of the descriptors here. There are a couple things I want to highlight. One is just the focus in that green circle in the top right. The focus of the coaching is being a partner. Dan shared in his very kind introduction that this is a shift away from traditional approaches to coaching that really rely more heavily on kind of fixing teachers, either implicitly or explicitly, right? Here I have to come in and get you to do something you're not doing already. But this is about a partnership, and it's about a partnership not toward doing the new curriculum or using the new program or trying this new strategy, but on a partnership that is focused first and foremost on learning for every student. So that's one big piece. The other piece I want to draw your attention to here is the use of data. That, and by data, I also want to say we mean, we really use the language of student evidence, as you can see in that inner circle or that inner ring. That by data, we don't just mean state test scores or big interim assessments or things that come in spreadsheets with bands and percentiles and things like that, but rather the work that students are doing every minute of every day that help us be responsive to the needs of all of our students, that help us differentiate instruction, that help us formatively assess in a way that is meaningful and relevant for what students need next to keep moving forward in their learning. So it's not something that's lorded over teachers to say, you're doing it right, good job for you because your kids got these test scores and then you over here not so much. That's not the way we're talking about it. We're talking about it as how can we look at this information to figure out what students already know and what they need next to keep them moving forward, and how can they use that information themselves too. And that's really a driver, again, for what we've seen in this last year, that it's critical that all of this that we're doing is geared toward creating the conditions in which we can garner this information, even if it's in a remote context. How can we know if our kids are getting it or not? So then we can answer the next question, how will we know what they need next? So that's kind of the big picture in this dartboard, looking at the bullseye of student learning, that really reminds us what this is about, that this is, as we said, about partnering with teachers in a way that promotes rigorous learning experiences for all of our students.
Thanks,
I'm gonna
Leanna.
turn it over to Diane.
Yeah, thanks. So to kind of keep driving with beliefs, thinking about how then do we do that as coaches? And there's a lot scheming against us when it comes to trying to stay in the center of that bullseye, as Leanna mentioned. But we feel as if, and we've seen plenty of evidence, that coaches can support academics and support students going deeper if we can help teachers create conditions where students self-assess. In this COVID era, students have been required to be more independent than ever imagined. We never thought second graders would be sitting at desks in households with other children trying to learn. And so how then do we shift the ownership a little bit over more so to the students to chart their own course as learners? And then how do we coach that? And that, to me and to Leanna, that is an exciting opportunity, because it's something through the visible learning research and other evidence that makes a huge difference for students. If they're not just bystanders and passively oriented to what's happening in a classroom, whether it's virtual, in-person, hybrid, if they can be much more active in the process, we're all better for it. So I've put on the screen here an example of a self-assessment tool that coaches and teachers have been creating together to do this heavy lifting. And what you see here is common. I'm not going to say it's this novel, brand new thing, but what you do see that's really, I just want to point out a few things that really make this a unique way to approach using a rubric and using learning targets. And picture this example tucked into a conversation between a teacher and a coach, or even a team of teachers and a coach. And so on the left side, you see the learning targets that are student friendly. This example is meant to be more of a primary example, and it's meant to be around the idea of sharing. It's a kind of a second language learning development example of sharing an opinion that includes connected ideas. That's the big intended learning. That's the bigger goal for the kids, for the students. You see then the not yet, the almost there, and the yes. Well, I want to point you out to the yes before we go anywhere else. That yes area means I'm there as a student. I know I'm there, and here's my evidence. So as coaches in this model, we're always using student evidence. Every single conversation is rooted in what did the students say? What did they do? What did they write? How did they approach a reading task? How did they approach a math task as they were digging into learning? And so the evidence is the proof. So if you look at these learning targets, they're very straightforward. I can share an opinion about an animal, book, movie, etc. And then there's a progression. And so the students can think, okay, I'm not there yet, but look at all the things I can do to get there. I can have a conference. I can practice this task by making a recording in something like Flipgrid. I can listen to some examples that maybe are provided by the teacher in a bank of exemplars. I can watch a video again of a lesson that maybe was taught on this. I can practice. And then you move over to almost there. So the students are moving themselves along. And this has become such an interesting thing for coaches to support teachers to do because A, it's aligned with the visible learning research. B, it increases student independence. They're not passively moving through learning like they used to. And the last reason is because it structures the sort of self-assessment kids oftentimes do, thumbs up, thumbs down, thumbs sideways. It structures it in a way that's much more concrete. It's based in the learning targets. Students need to provide evidence when they feel like they're there. And so I could see students feeling as if, wow, now I have a roadmap. The learning isn't all just a mysterious, what's the next lesson, but rather it's, here's what I need to do as a learner. So let's look at how then we can take this into more coaching. So how can coaches create the conditions for this to happen? And so in this chapter 6 in the book, this is one of our tools. And this is a tool that's a language tool. So it's language for coaching into self-assessment. And I'm not going to read these to you, but you get a sense that all of these coaching questions really are about building toward having students able to do this kind of lifting of their own. So it's just really fun to think about if this is an opportunity for coaching into rigor and engagement and independence, this is something we co-construct right alongside teachers. And I'm going to turn it back over to Leanna. Who might be muted because, you know, it's always the mute unmute.
Thank you. It is the mute unmute. I was in a webinar the other day and someone said that's what's going to be on all of our headstones when we don't forget to unmute. So thank you, Diane. This next belief is taking us further into where we're trying to go as far as thinking about independent learners, right? We talked about self-assessment, that students need to have that ability, not only to have clarity on what's expected of them, but then to use that to check in and be directors of their own learning, right? We know that that's a huge piece of creating learners that are independent. So how do we continue to think about what coaches can do? Because this is our belief that coaches can support teachers to cultivate independence and engagement among teachers. So independence, like I said, we started to see a little bit of it. This idea that we need to create the conditions where students can self-assess, but it goes beyond that. How are we creating the opportunities for them to be able to engage independently with the work? I'm guessing that many of us, both from our own experience as students, maybe from our own experience as teachers, and certainly with teachers that we partner with as coaches, have worked with teachers who in the past or maybe have been still in that mode of kind of stand and deliver instruction, or, you know, some of us say sage on the stage, right? And then this pandemic hit and we have the sudden pivot to a virtual setting, and that kind of just the teacher doing all the talking and the teacher doing all the heavy lifting wasn't going to fly, right? So there was, for some teachers and the coaches they worked with, a lot of scrambling that went on. Our hope is we can continue to work with teachers to create the conditions for the students to be doing the heavy lifting, the students to be able to function independently within the classroom, whatever setting that classroom may be happening in, and that in turn will carry forward as we think about the kind of learning we want to see in our classrooms. So it's first important to think through the lens of what we even mean by engagement. It's a word we throw around a lot, or I should say we just try to address a lot, but we may have found ourselves in conversations where what one person is talking about when they talk about engagement, and then maybe what you as the coach or somebody else are thinking of, aren't really the same thing. And I think this maybe helps us understand why that might be. That oftentimes, and perhaps most commonly, when people talk about engagement, what they're really talking about is behavioral engagement, right? Following the rules, being motivated by extrinsic factors. Am I going to get a bad grade? I want to get a good grade. Or am I going to get into trouble? Things like that. So certainly you could walk into a classroom and see students behaving, and that's a motivating factor for them. That's a type of engagement. Then we might be thinking about emotional engagement, that idea of feeling safe and feeling known and feeling like you're a part of the classroom community. And we know how critical that has been again this year, and how we've often had to really think out of the box on ways to engage students in this way, not just by the threat of bad grades, but ways to get them to tune in and want to be a part, even in this crazy remote, setting where they might be, sitting on top of their bed still in their pajamas. How do we get them to turn on the camera and feel like they belong and want to be a part of our virtual classroom? And then lastly is the idea of cognitive engagement, that students are really actually invested and truly invested in the learning. And instead of being extrinsically motivated, that they're intrinsically motivated. And that comes from a sense of relevance, a need to know, a feeling of challenge, and wanting to figure things out. So again, what are we even talking about when we're talking about engagement? We may think of these as, 3 legs of a stool, and you need all 3 legs for that stool to be stable, right? That we need all 3 types of engagement to really successfully educate our young people. And Diane and I would both say that we believe that's true, but I hope we can also all agree that maybe they don't weigh, equally, each 3 of these. That yes, you need behavioral engagement, but do we really want that to be our driving factor? Probably not. What we're really going after with the support of the other 2 is getting to that cognitive engagement. That yes, students follow the rules and they behave in a way that allows productive learning to happen. And yes, they feel connected to us as the adults and to each other as a community of learning, so that they have that desire to be present and to show up, but that we, alongside the teachers who we partner with, help create the conditions where students really dig in cognitively, that they want to learn, that they want to know, that they want to figure it out, to solve it, to know what's next, and all of that good, juicy, meaty, rigorous kind of stuff that we're going after. So how can we do that as coaches? What is our role as student-centered coaching in trying to bring this about? Here you have a tool. Again, this is in the book, and it's some ways that coaches can support teachers in really working toward this idea of independence. I'm not going to read them all for you. I know you're all capable, but I do want to highlight a few. One part way, I'm going to jump around a little here, but one, the 4th one down, using the noticing and naming strategy to watch for students who are struggling or stuck in a way that's no longer productive. We all talk about, particularly in the context of math, but we believe it applies everywhere, the idea of productive struggle, that students need opportunities to grapple with big ideas and with challenging concepts and content. That's how we learn, right? And that's how we get to exhibit that cognitive engagement. But by the same time, as educators, we also have to have systems in place to understand when productive kind of switches over to not so productive, that maybe a group of students are going down the wrong path and they're now starting to kind of develop some misconceptions about something. That would be a time we need to redirect, right? So we, as coaches and teachers, and something we can model and work with our teachers, is this idea of embedded formative assessment, this immediately responsive approach to teaching that, it's about seeing what's happening. And this can be even in the virtual setting. We have the ability to chat with each other and still kind of have sidebar conversations with teachers in the virtual classroom setting. Certainly easier to do, but also very doable in person. And being aware when these things are happening and having those conversations and saying, hey, we're seeing this, we're noticing this. Do we want to keep letting them go? Do we think it's time to redirect? What do you think? What do you know? And having that dialogue in the moment that really models what we mean by responsive teaching and what we mean by embedded formative assessment. That's a huge way that we can bring something to the table to teachers to help work towards students being independent. Another
Leanna,
one.
if I can,
Oh, sorry.
Leanna, if I
Yeah.
can point out one thing here too, is that all of these moves that a coach can use to create more student independence can be done in a virtual, hybrid, or in-person setting.
Yep.
And so learning is learning. And if we're over scaffolding, under scaffolding, if we're not aware of where students are as learners, all of that is part of the I guess I would say, the fabric of our coaching conversations with teachers. Where are the kids? Where do we want the kids to be? And then what can we do to move them along? And so that's just interesting to look at this through the lens of this checklist is never going to expire. There's no expiration date on this because this is about looking at learning as it's happening.
Exactly. Thank you, Diane. And I think that is so much of our big idea here, that as you're reading through this list and the other tools as well, we want to encourage you to be asking yourselves, okay, what does this look like in the virtual setting? What does this look like in the hybrid setting? What does this look like if we're in person, but we have masks on, or when we no longer, someday soon, we hope, have masks on? And to be thinking, like Diane said, that this isn't just about this moment. And hopefully, you know, we don't sound like a broken record, but that you're really taking that to heart, that this is good teaching. These are the things we need to be doing all the time. And yes, maybe it takes a little more effort or a little tweaking to make it happen in a virtual classroom setting. That's okay, right? That's the challenge of this moment. But we want to make sure that this is happening in every context in which we find ourselves and far beyond. So thinking about these in a variety of contexts, absolutely. The other one I just want to highlight is this idea, the second one, of creating rituals and routines that provide students with the space to dig in first, and then if needed to get help based on their specific needs. Too often we see teachers doing the heavy lifting. I think back to a math teacher I had the beginning of high school, and we all, you know, I hate to say it, but we kind of had him pegged, and we all knew if we just sat there long enough, we could beat him at the waiting game. And he would ask questions of us, but we would all just sit there, and then he'd answer the questions. You know, the poor person was doing all the work. But really the other sad part is that we were missing out on the learning. So our job is to work with teachers to say, how do we create those spaces where students can dig in, where they get to grapple first, where they have the supports in place for what they need to be able to do this hard and rigorous work. And again, in the virtual classroom, in person, anywhere in between. But having the conversations, even envisioning these as, what questions can I ask that would help uncover these different pieces in here so I can coach toward this with my teachers.
And each of these really includes sub-questions and sub-conversations so that it is a bigger conversation. There was a question in the chat just about what this looks like for ELs, and I'm assuming that means you're thinking of English learners, English language learners, and with that question. I do want to just mention that example of the self-assessment that we just looked at a few slides ago with the explaining your opinion about something. That came from an English language learner class. So this really isn't specific to a certain content area, grade level. It's about, and one big piece of it is driving from the standards. So I saw a shout out in the chat also just about shifting to a more standards-based approach. So no matter what your standards are, if you're a STEM school and you have tech standards, if you're got a lot of ELLs and you're using the the WIDA standards for language development, whatever it is, this is in relation to that. Just wanted to point that out based on a question in the chat. But let's move ourselves forward, if that's okay. Leanna, were you going to say something?
I was just going to address another question, since we have a minute here, about how do we even start this conversation? And I think that's a really wonderful question, because I'm guessing we would all agree that the last thing we want to do is put teachers in a place where they feel defensive, that we're criticizing them, about their beliefs about students or their expectations for students. These can be tricky waters to navigate. That is for sure. And especially now when everybody is like doubly, stressed and on edge and overwhelmed. So how do we start this conversation? And I think both Diane and our first answer is always, what good questions can we ask, right? Not leading questions, but true probing questions. And if we come from a place of questioning, it comes from a place without judgment. So even asking students, or pardon me, teachers, things, once we've determined what the desired learning outcome is, to say, all right, what's it going to take for students to be successful in achieving this? And what supports would need to be in place? And what kind of scaffolds might we have to, put in place? For example, to the last question, for our non-native English speakers, for our special ed students that are in there with learning differences, for these kids, for those kids, what needs to be in place so that every student can be successful in this learning? And those are questions without judgment. That's not challenging a teacher about his or her expectations for students, no matter how low or how high they may be. It's just modeling good teaching that leads to good planning. So the more we can help uncover and get to that point of clarity of what will success look like, and then what will students need to be successful, we can start that conversation in a way that it doesn't bring judgment. It is growth oriented. We're all going to learn together from this. I don't have answers in my head that I'm like fishing for you as the teacher to get out. It's really about us partnering to figure it out together and promoting opportunities for reflection that can lead to these deep and successful learning opportunities for all students.
We have a question in the chat about when we're trying this kind of questioning, sometimes teachers will just say, tell me what to do. And we have a process that we wrote extensively about in the Essential Guide for Student-Centered Coaching. I think there's a whole chapter there, as well as the moves, Student-Centered Coaching, the moves, about strengths-based feedback. And there has to be a progression of thought. And we can't just say, okay, I'll tell you what to do. It would be nice if everything was that easy. But the idea is that we build a plan together through clarifying and probing questions. So it would be, well, let me understand what you have going on. Now let's figure out what we can do, and let's figure out what that might look like, and what do you think? And so it's about co-construction. And we've heard that tell me what to do before ourselves. And a lot of it just means we have to go back and ask another great question and just say, well, what are you trying to get done? Or what does the standard require? Or what are some ways we could go about this? So great thinking in the chat. We'll keep answering them in writing or verbally as we have time, but we're going to segue to a big belief of ours that is really around partnering with teachers to create tasks that lead to deep learning. And there's a little bit here I just want to pull out. One is that we have a very strong part of our model is co-planning. We don't necessarily believe that we go in, watch a lesson, and then give a teacher feedback on how it went. I'm just going to say that's not our model. And that's because that didn't work for Leanna or I. We've coached together in schools across the country for many, many years, and that just felt like an evaluation. And we have a very strong belief system that we co-construct, we co-plan, we co-teach as coaches. So we're in there doing the work side by side. And so this belief in this chapter really gets at the idea of how do we co-plan, which is partnering with teachers. It's another term for that. How do we do that in a way where we're creating really amazing opportunities for kids to engage deeply? And there's some coaching moves in that we'll look at. One thing just to mention is that there is always going to need to be then language in your language bank, like we were just talking about questioning, but language in your language bank, that's your co-planning language. So these tend to oftentimes be questions, not in here there are a lot of questions, but don't think it's only, we can't only speak in questions or that would get very awkward very quickly. But it's the idea that we are thinking ahead with teachers about what's our co-planning or what's our lesson going to look like? What needs to be in place so that every student can be successful? And so then we're thinking ahead about what are some misconceptions? What might students get confused about? We may work the problem together in our co-planning session just to shake free any things that might be challenges. Again, we need to be thinking about all of our student populations, whether they're second language learners or anybody, all kids. And so when we think about coaching and we're in classrooms and we think about equity, all kids is always on our radar. We're never just coaching a couple kids. It's always really, how do we bring everyone along to the goal that we've set? And we're always thinking about scaffolds with teachers. And one that I just want to throw out that's particularly interesting and a little bit challenging is the idea of what scaffolds might we remove? Not just what are we going to add? People always think about how are we going to scaffold lessons. I'd say think about how are we going to de-scaffold lessons, because a lot of times kids get so supported that they don't get a chance to get in that productive struggle space. And so that's a great question to just put in your back pocket when you're co-planning, if you'd like to really get into the space of let's make sure students are learning deeply. I mean, obviously we've talked about language development, and also how will kids demonstrate understanding? Are they all going to do the same thing exactly in the same way? Are they going to all fill in a graphic organizer that has the same words in every box? So when we go to look at it together and sort that student evidence, it all looks the same and doesn't tell us anything about the students? Well, that wouldn't take us into any deep learning or deep planning for that matter. So that whole idea of planning to have evidence, planning to make sure students have a chance to get in the mess of learning and to struggle a little bit, not in a way that's too much, but and make sure that we've thought about all of these things before a lesson takes place. Because man, I tell you, if you go in and a lesson hasn't been co-planned, but you've been in there during the lesson as a coach, it is way too late to coach that lesson. That lesson is gone. It's done. It's happened. If you try to coach that lesson that you never had a part of planning, you're going to start sounding like you're critiquing or evaluating the lesson, no matter what you try. We advocate to get in on the front end. Let's co-plan together. Let's make sure the learning is deep. And then let's see how it all goes, how it all happens. I'll be in there with you. And then we loop back and we do it again. Maybe, in a week or so. It doesn't have to be every day. But let's look at some examples. So we threw these in, these are from the book as well. And these are just really interesting examples to look through the eye of how do these create conditions for deep learning? Or do these create conditions for deep learning? And these are cute, for sure. There's a lot here. I'm not going to necessarily analyze each thing here. But if I was a coach, I want to put the coach hat on here. If I was a coach and a teacher pulled this out and said, this is what I'm doing with my kids, how could I coach this to be deeper? How could I say, okay, let's look at this and think, does this take our students into a space where they can productively struggle, where they have to really use math strategies, or does it not? And I'm going to say it looks like it's engaging, but it's not really all that deep. It's cute word problems that match a theme, but students can figure out pretty quickly, all I need to do is take the two numbers and multiply them. I don't really even have to read the problems. So this is an example of something that a teacher might think is deep, but as a coach, we have to figure out how to take it deeper. And so we could go back to those questions and we could say, how are we gonna, is there a productive struggle here? How are students gonna show what they know? Here's another example, one word problem from a math, common math problem where a student has to decide This is, I'm just going to kind of give you an orientation to the problem itself. Naomi owns a small farm where she raises pigs and chickens. She has 18 animal heads and 50 animal legs. How many pigs does she have? How many chickens does she have? Be sure to show your work and your brilliant thinking. So when we look at this, we start thinking, okay, does this fit the criteria of an open, deep learning task? Which actually we include in the chapter. We didn't include in this webinar, but there is a criteria there. Does it include that? So we have to start thinking, okay, do students have multiple opportunities to dive in? Can they show their work in their own way? Can they use whatever strategies they need? So this starts to become more deep. This is, actually, this is it. Sorry, I forgot that we included this. This is your checklist. So you can look at that, you can use this checklist. I'll kind of think about this with you against those two examples. You can use this checklist, and this was adapted by Fisher, Fry, and Hattie in their book that just came out, this to adapt, the Visible Learning, Distance Learning Playbook. This really was inspired by that book. But the cool thing is this is where we can look at these criteria. Can students solve problems in more than one way? And by problem, it could be reading problem. It's not just math focused, but the two examples happen to be math focused. Can they share strategies they used as a learner, like as a reader, as a writer, as a scientist? Can they apply information somehow? So whatever they're learning. And then can they think before they're asked to respond? Are they given think time? And are they allowed as on their own with agency to decide how they're going to approach the learning? Or do we micromanage them and tell them how to do it and walk them through it step by step? So when you look at this checklist, then you can see how this could be a really useful tool to analyze tasks with teachers. To say, let's look at this against this. Let's look at this in relation to this. And let's think about, does this, whatever task we're about to ask our students to do, does that lead to deep learning? And so that's a big piece of the co-planning. Let's look and see the kind of work we're putting in front of our students. So that kind of leads us to, go ahead, Leo, sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. I was just going to add a couple things there. That remember at the beginning, we talked about that equity piece and that we've been talking about all the way through. And this is another lens we can use to think about equity. Remember, we said it doesn't mean that some kids forever who are the behind kids, who are grade levels behind and, just can't, and the deficit, lens that we, sometimes fall into looking through, that they never get the rigorous, meaty, engaging kind of work. But if you go back to the pigs and chickens problem, Diane, on the last slide, hopefully what we can see there is that if you had a classroom of students at a variety of levels and skill levels, this is open-ended enough that all students could engage in it. I would argue you could give this to a wide range of ages of students, and they could all find an entry point to try to figure it out, to struggle with it, to try on different strategies, to problem solve, to dig in. And so this is also what we mean when we look at the checklist and hold tasks up against it. We're also helping promote that access for students, that equity piece, that we can challenge all of our students, no matter where they fall in terms of being on, above, at, above, or below grade level with these kind of open-ended problems. And so that's another thing that we just really hope people are taking away. And again, particularly now for those of us who are still working in the virtual platform, moving to virtual, we all found it needs to be more than just digitizing if it was the low level stuff that was happening in the classroom and then making it in something that could happen virtually. We didn't do our students any favors in that regard. We still need to push for this kind of rigor, this kind of open-endedness, this kind of access, high ceiling, low floor that we want to see in the virtual setting and in the in-person setting. Again, it's no different, but we want to make sure that all kids are having access to this.
Yeah. And the idea too that we have to be monitoring along the way, right? We're not just pushing them off into this space of struggle without monitoring. And that's another role for a coach to play, is to be continuously looking at the student evidence with students. With teachers. So this is a great example of where a teacher and coach can sit down together and say, let's look at the stack of these. Let's look, and it could be anything. It could be a stack of math journals where the students are writing in spirals. It could be something in a tech format where students are entering their thinking in through video or through Seesaw or something like that. But the idea is that we're going to be looking closely at this work to decide what strategies are they using, where are they getting confused, what do they need next, and then what do we do next? And that's the whole coaching model in a nutshell, is what do we do next based on what they're doing right now. And so it's just interesting to think that it took us a while to think about our role as much in relationship to building deep learning opportunities, as it's like COVID brought that out in our work, where I think it was implicit, but now it's explicit. Now it's, if we can't see where kids are, we can't teach, we can't coach. And so what we're asking students to do makes all the difference. And it's just so fun to see all your comments and your thinking about this. And we have a couple minutes we can continue to answer questions. So throw in your questions. And if you'd like a question to be specifically answered, just put a note next to it. Like, this is my big question I need to have answered. So don't hesitate to do that, because we don't want to leave you feeling like there's a loose end. So as we kind of get to wrapping up today and thinking about where we go next, I'm going to leave that to Leanna to think with you about. And then I'll monitor the questions as well.
Okay, thank you. So again, we really dove into this work when we wanted to think about a resource that is very real about how to coach in this moment, as the book we believe is. And admittedly, we focused more today on a part that goes really far beyond. But also we wanted every practice that we examined in each of the chapters to address this question that we have here at the top. Because if we go back to just normal and the way things were, as if none of this ever happened, and if we didn't learn anything from this, I think we'd be doing such a tremendous disservice to the students that we serve. There was a lot of rich opportunities for learning. And I don't just mean all of us becoming more comfortable with things like Zoom and Seesaw and Pear Deck, which I'm very invariably we all have, but really bigger ideas. How do we better address this equity gap that exists so in such a real way in many of our schools? How do we make sure that all students have access to intellectually engaging and rigorous, learning opportunities? So this is what we wanted to address specifically to that issue, that we, as we've talked about today, continue to design systems for students to self-assess as a way to create that independence that we know is so vital to their success, both in the classroom, in this world of school, and beyond. That we trust students to guide their own learning and not feel that, as the adults, as the teachers and coaches, that they aren't capable, but that we have high expectations for students and believe that they are capable. That, as Diane shared with us, that we co-plan lessons that remove barriers for students to acquire content and to learn those processing skills. So that, again, it's about creating those opportunities for this kind of engagement. And as came up a little bit earlier from that wonderful question that someone asked, how do you even start this conversation? That we have to be brave, but respectful when we have these coaching conversations. We can't take our judgment into it. We have to talk to our colleagues in a way that honors where they are in the process and yet gives them opportunities to reflect and to think about how they can maintain high expectations for all of their students and how they can create opportunities for students to be successful in those situations. So our hope in all of this is, yes, we still have a lot to get through. We're not done yet, as we all know, much as we all want to be, but really that we keep our gaze also facing forward so that we can learn from this experience and all come out the better and the better able to serve our students in the end. So with that, I'm guessing there were some more questions. Diane, you want to jump in, or you want to do this part first?
Well, here's some just contact information for you. For anybody who wants, we have lots of free resources. So we have a podcast that includes international school and US school coaches. We have a Facebook group that's just super lively and fun. If you're a Facebooker, where you can join, and just the usual channels of a blog. And yeah, we just posted today a blog post just about the different books and sort of how do they serve, which book, why, and when sort of blog posts. So there's useful information there for sure. So jump in and stay in touch with us. And we'll hear a great little closing remarks from Sharon from Corwin in just a sec. But I want to just close with a brief little story, and this shows gratitude, I think. My daughter was doing her high school Spanish class at the kitchen counter the other day, and I heard her teacher, he's a lovely, super dedicated guy, talking about how hard it is to teach. And he was saying to the students, I can't hear you. I can't see you. I don't even, it's hard for me to even help you when I can't hear you or see you. And he was just sort of reaching out to the students, just begging them to be more a part of the learning, more visibly a part of the learning, because they're doing the work. I don't doubt it. But it just reminded me of, I've been hearing that conversation ever since, because it just reminds me of where teachers are right now and how, if anything, as coaches, we can be thinking partners and we can be helping them do this work. Because there's no teacher on earth that doesn't want to take their learning deeper, that doesn't want to engage students, that doesn't want to do all the things we've been talking about in this webinar. And so just to offer as you're trying to get started in this, just to offer to be a thinking partner, to answer the question of how can I be sure all my students are learning? That alone is where coaches come into the mix. That teacher deserves a coach to be by his side. He needs that. I don't think he has it, but what a shame. And so we can provide that to teachers. So I just want to thank you for being there for teachers more than anything, because it's such an important piece of the bigger educational picture. And I want to give a shout out to Frederick. If we had a prize, he would get it, because he got the math problem, pigs and chickens, correct. So good job, Frederick. I don't see any other questions in the chat.
Yeah, wait, Dan, there were a couple. It got busy, so I went back. Okay, so a couple of things. One, Amy asked, what's the #1 topic coaches should focus on right now to support student achievement? And Amy, the idea here is it's all driven by what teachers are already doing and what is in the standards wherever you're teaching. So the beautiful thing about this approach to coaching is it's not content or topic specific, but it's again driven by student learning. So it's a matter of sitting down with a teacher, talking about what do their students need to, know, understand, and do, whatever subject area you're in, and then partnering with them to say, okay, here's where we want students to be. Let's see where they are now. And then our coaching work, our partnership will live in that space in between those 2 points. In other words, we're going to work together to get them from point A to point B. So it's really not topic specific. It really falls over everything that teachers and coaches do. And it really is driven by the student learning at hand. So that was one. And then another question I just wanted to ask, someone had a question, what book is a good starting place. The essential guide for student-centered coaching, the one you see on this slide on the bottom left, is a big kind of philosophical foundation and overview. It still has a lot of tools, but it's a lot of big picture. The middle book, Student-Centered Coaching, The Moves, is more hands-on, more tool, how-to oriented, and leading student-centered coaching, of course, if you're a school administrator, a district administrator, to think about your role in all of this. And then our newest book is really addressing this moment, but as we've said many times, with lots of tools and thinking and strategies that go well beyond. So hopefully that just gives a quick overview.
Yeah. Awesome. Thanks, Leanna. And this is the new one. So I love the cover, by the way. It's so beautiful because it's about gazing into the distance. And I think Sharon's going to close up for us today.
Yes, thank you, Diane and Leanna. And thank you also for mentioning www.dianesweeney.com. So packed with lots of resources. I've signed up for the newsletter. It brings me joy when I see it come into my inbox. I encourage you to check out so many resources that are really useful there. And also, if you would like to order student-centered coaching from a distance, coaching moves for virtual, hybrid, and in-person classrooms, I'm sure it will be a favorite on your shelf that you'll return to long after we get back into class and whatever that looks like in person. And if you do it using promo code webinars, that is case sensitive to all caps, please, at www.corwin.com, we'll be happy to give you 20% off plus get free shipping. The book will be in our warehouse this week, so I know that you'll want to be one of the first to get it. So please order when you feel comfortable. And then we will be sending out a recording of this session within 1 week, and it will also include your PD certificate. So I see that we have people from all over, so have a wonderful rest of your day, whether that's morning, noon, or night, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you so much, everybody. Bye-bye.